Okay, so I'm Dave Gillum. I'm director of WOW, Wales One World Film Festival, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, has been running for 20 years each March. And we went online for the first time last March and thought, this is rather fun. And because we had the time and we had a bit of money, we thought we'd run another event this autumn. So this is the first ever Eco Cinema Festival. And very pleased, particularly to get the film The Last Forest into it. When I saw it, I thought it was a truly remarkable film, really, in the way that it gives you an insight into the Yanomami's world and their worldview, and that it's really quite a radical film because it throws up a mirror to our own world and worldview, which I think makes us think quite deeply about how we are and what we do. And so I'm particularly pleased to be able to do this event tonight and to have with us Fiona Watson from Survival International and Sue Branford from the Latin America Bureau. And I shall give them a chance to introduce themselves rather than me doing it. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. Sue and Fiona and I are going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're going to open up to questions from all of you. So do think of your questions, and B, you can put them into the chat, and we have with us Rowan, who's going to keep an eye on any questions that get put there. If you want to ask the questions yourselves, you can either put your hand up in the kind of traditional way, or use the reactions that are at the bottom bar of Zoom and put up your hand there, which saves you standing there like that. And also just to say to everybody that this is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, keep your camera off and don't ask the questions. So I think without further ado, we shall start. So I'd perhaps ask Fiona Watson first to introduce herself and what she does at Survival and her history with the Yanomami.
Okay, thanks, Dave, and also thanks to you and your team and everyone at Wales One World Festival for putting this event on. And hello to everybody who's tuning in. Yeah, I'm Fiona. I'm the campaigns director at Survival International. And for those of you who don't know Survival, we're the global movement for tribal and Indigenous people's rights. So we are working with Indigenous and tribal peoples around the world, supporting them to defend their lives, their livelihoods, and other rights, particularly the land rights and the right to self-determination, which are both so essential to their survival and well-being. And I've worked with Survival for over 30 years, and the very first campaign I worked on at Survival was with the Yanomami, together with Davi Kopenawa Yanomami, who you saw in the film, and the Pro-Yanomami Commission in Brazil, an NGO in Brazil, and Survival internationally. We worked on a 20-year lobbied and campaigned for 20 years for Yanomami land rights, which were eventually recognized by the Brazilian government in 1992. So a very fundamental thing. And so that I worked on that for a long time. And so I've always had a long-term relationship with the Yanomami, and know them well, and have visited a number of their communities over the last 30 years. So for me, it was particularly great to see Davi and Watoriki, the community featured in the film, acting and speaking. It was really fantastic. So I'll talk about that more later. That's just my intro.
Thank you, Fiona. And Sue, do you want to say a little bit too about what you do and your history in Brazil?
Sure, David. Well, I'm a journalist. My first posting was out in Brazil in 1974. And although I haven't just been covering Indigenous affairs, I've been reporting on the whole of Brazil, but I've visited a lot of Indigenous communities and done a lot of reports on them. So it's been interesting for me to accompany what is more than 40 years of what's going on to Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples in Brazil. Now, my last job was with the BBC World Service, and now I'm officially retired, but I'm still doing quite a lot of reporting for an American website, Comonga Bay, and I'm also a managing editor at Latin American Bureau, which some of you will know, which is a progressive website and provides the kind of coverage on Latin America that you're not going to get very readily from the mainstream press, when mainly run by volunteers.
Thank you. I mean, it's something we all need is finding good sources of information that we can trust, rather than those that are just there and not so trustworthy. So I just thought we would start, with the film and your experience of watching The Last Forest and what you made of it. So I think I'll come back to Sue first, really, and just take us through a bit, what you felt about it and what you thought about the film.
I saw it for the first time last night, actually, and I didn't really know anything about it. I thought it was a great film, but I also find it sort of slightly bewildering. I was wondering sometimes whether it was a documentary. Some of it seemed to be a documentary, but it was very clear when they were telling the story of the myths of the creation of the Yanomami that they were actually acting it out, which I thought they did brilliantly. But I'd just like to, perhaps Fiona, you know much more about it from the beginning. Perhaps you could just tell us a bit more about what they were wanting and the whole history of the film.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I think it was really great. It's the first time I think that you've seen the Yanomami acting in a film that is essentially their film. All the dialogue, I mean, you have Davi who's narrating and speaking a lot, and then the Yanomami actors talking in their own language. And I think that's a first for the Yanomami. I mean, it's not a first with other indigenous peoples around the world, but for the Yanomami. And if you think that, the Yanomami are still a relatively isolated people living in the rainforests on the border of Brazil and Venezuela, I think this is a really important first. And I think the Yanomami, from what my understanding from speaking to them, is that they see the film firstly as a tool to talk about what their values and beliefs are, to show themselves as a people. And I think one of the things that comes out very strongly in the film, and indeed I think with my work with Indigenous peoples, is this fantastic ability to live collectively. And that's symbolized at the very beginning of the film, where you get that amazing aerial shot of the rocky mountain, and then this beautiful sort of donut looking shaped community at the bottom. And so I think they see it as a way of communicating their values to a world that predominantly is extremely hostile to them, and increasingly so. And we can talk about the problems later. And for me, I think other aspects of it, I mean, I see your point, Sue, about it. I'm sure it is confusing to people. I mean, I was a bit confused as well at times, but I liked that hybrid, where you go into, mythology, you go into dreams, you have the shamans doing a session at the end, a group of shamans, and then you go into the stark realities, and you have those incredible black and white photographs of Claudia Andujar, the Brazilian photographer, showing very ill Yanomami, shots of the aerial shots of the terrible impact of the mining invasion on the forest and on the people. And then you have Davi on the radio communicating with other communities and getting annoyed because they're not switching off at the right time. There's a lot of humor there, a lot of, just sort of the day-to-day stuff, seeing people chopping firewood, the women making hammocks and baskets. So you've got this incredible mixture, but I think that makes for a really rich film. And I'd be interested later to hear what all the listeners here think about it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree. I think in a way it sort of asks you to keep up, doesn't it, as they slide through slightly different, ways of telling a story and showing their creation myths and showing their rituals and so on. And I think, in some senses it speaks to that they have control over it, which is, it's not just an ethnographic ontological documentary, which is what you might start to think it might be, but that they've been given control over it, and that they have a sophisticated sense of what they want to do actually, and that they mix quite a lot of different things and get, as you say, quite a lot of different angles in there, and give you a very rich experience. So I would just like to take you back, because obviously Davi is a pretty key character here. I mean, both in narrating the film, but also in a sense his role in the Yanomami community, and that the idea I discovered this morning that you go back 30 years to chaperoning him around TV studios when he found the city rather noisy, as he points out. You know, you can only sleep quietly in you know, where he lives, and that sense of somebody who's really, you know, it's a very yeah, sort of sophisticated understanding of the relationship between his culture and our culture and what he needs to do to protect it. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about him and that kind of, you know, journey he's been on.
Well, yeah, both Fiona and I met him on the first time, one of his first trips abroad, wasn't it, Fiona? Which year was it? 1989.
Yeah.
And I was doing some translation for him, but he was actually bewildered. I'll never forget, he turned to me in the street and said, "You who know the Amazon forest, how can you choose to live here with all this noise, this pollution?" And also there was a lot of misunderstanding, though, because we did one or two live interviews, which I thought was a mistake because I had to translate. And I remember the very first interview that we did on television, the presenter turned and said, "Well, what's the role of television, Davi, in broadcasting and getting your message out to the world?" And Davi turned to me. Well, I knew Davi didn't know what television was. And so, I mean, the luck was that we were live. So I could say, well, you know, he's not going to understand that what you're asking. I mean, I'm going to ask him something else. You know, what is the message that he wants to get out? And of course, Indians speak quite, he was quite slow in responding and thinking through, because that's what Indians do. And I remember the producer kind of waving madly to me to bring it to a close, but there's not very much they could do. So we went on for a while. But and he didn't really speak very good English then, did he? Can you remember, Fiona?
Oh, you mean Portuguese?
Sorry, he didn't speak very good Portuguese then.
No, I think that because it was the first time that he left Brazil. But I think for me, Davi's an extremely key person for the Yanomami because he straddles both worlds. He lost his parents in the terrible epidemics in the 60s that came in with outsiders. The particular epidemic that killed his relatives was brought in by new tribes missionaries who'd set up a mission in the area. And so he was orphaned, and he became an interpreter for FUNAI, the Indigenous Affairs Department in Brazil, and traveled out to places like Manaus and Boa Vista, the state capital of Roraima, where a lot of the Yanomami territory is. And he's an extremely curious person and a very astute person. So he saw this different world, and he understood how the Napa, the white people, the Napas, the Yanomami call them, operate. And that's been really crucial to his fight. And so I think, I mean, to me, he's a philosopher, he's a shaman, he's a philosopher, he's a very deep thinker. And if you really want to get inside the head of a shaman, the best book I've read about it is his book written with Bruce Albert called The Falling Sky. And I'll give a plug for Survival. We're selling it in our bookshop, and it's in English and Portuguese and French. And it's also a fantastic critique of our Western world, our consumption, our overconsumption. And it's a message, it's a very profound message, which I think comes across in the film, in which he said to me many times, you people outside don't know this, but the shamans, we are holding up the sky, because that's part of their mythology, is that the world is divided into 4 levels, and they are, and you see that in the shamanism sequence, this holding up the sky. So they're holding up the sky not just for the Yanomami, who are the best guardians of their forests, as are all indigenous peoples of their environments, but we're doing it for you, for humanity, for the planet. So it's a really very strong message, and a lot of fantastic critique on what he thinks of us in the West and our way of life, and how how we don't know how to live collectively. Essentially, we've lost that. I mean, not everybody, obviously, but generally speaking, it's a very, very interesting book, and he's a great thinker.
Yes, and it's very readable as well. I mean, you get gripped by it. And somebody is asking in the chat whether there's an audible version, an audio book. but I don't.
No, not yet. Not
Okay.
yet.
Yeah. Let's take questions from the chat a bit later. Yeah, let's just keep this going. So, I mean, obviously he's brought quite a lot of that into the film, isn't he? I mean, that a lot of that kind of thinking is there. And I just wonder if you could, perhaps we'll start with Sue again, talk a little bit more about that relationship with, as it were, the outside world, with people coming in, the miners, and in a sense, you know, that sense that it's a kind of dynamic relationship, and you can see in the film that there are certain things that they take and certain things they don't want to take. And perhaps just give us a little bit more of a background of that and the situation in Brazil and how that's working through, you know.
I think there is a bit of a misconception often about Indigenous peoples, that they are kind of stuck in time and they want to carry on with their way of life without change. But in fact, for hundreds of years, they have actually welcomed new technology when it is of use to them. I remember there's actually a headdress in the British Museum from the Kayapo Indians, and rather to anthropologists' amazement, it was made in the late 19th century. It's actually incorporating, using a European fabric, because the Indians found that this fabric was longer lasting than the cotton that they were weaving and using. So they incorporated it. And I think this kind of thing has happened with most Indigenous people throughout their histories. They're not against new technology, they just want to use it, choose whether they want it or not, and adapt it to their way of life. And I suppose what has made it more pressing than ever to sort of start to understand a bit of the Yanomami, and actually to realize that the world needs this sort of different vision. I think when you watch this film, you realize that they have a different view of the world from us. They don't, and it's a very valid and many of us think a superior view. And I think that, I mean, the Yanomami have had a long history of driving out, of combating gold panners who have invaded their land. And unfortunately for the Yanomami, their land has got enormous mineral wealth. And they thought about 20 years ago that they had more or less won this struggle, and the government would keep gold panners out. But now under Bolsonaro, who I'm sure of you know is this one of the worst presidents that Brazil has ever had, and has quite openly said that he thinks the Indians have got too much land and they should hand some of it over to big farmers and to miners, both the wildcat miners, the garimpeiros, and the big mining companies. So he's doing everything he can to combat them, and the Indigenous people are fighting back with enormous determination and courage. And I think very much aware that they've got to win this battle because the survival of their forest is at stake.
Okay, Fiona, you know, I hope you can hear us. You've come back in. You know, do you want to just amplify that a little bit? Because obviously from over here, we tend to see a very bleak picture of Bolsonaro. And well, in our conversation this morning, you know, was saying that, you know, there are different things going on and it's more complex than that. Perhaps you could just talk a little bit about that and the, you know, what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think there are many things happening in terms of both environmental legislation and Indigenous rights. And as Sue said, the Bolsonaro government, and particularly Bolsonaro himself, want to overturn the constitution in many ways and completely destroy or weaken Indigenous people's rights. And there's a big case that's just been postponed yet again at the Supreme Court. And so this is really important because it is life or death. On the other hand, I don't think we should give up hope. I think there's a lot going on in Brazil. There are all sorts of social movements, and the Indigenous movement has really come together. I mean, when I first started, I lived in Brazil in the 1980s, up in Roraima, where the Yanomami live. There were a handful of Indigenous organisations. I think there were 3 at the time nationally. Now there are literally hundreds. And there's a very big one that is a coordinating body of Amazonian indigenous organizations. There's ones in the south, there's a national one, APIBE, and they have come together, and they're doing ferocious lobbying, organizing mass demonstrations. The Yanomami themselves had a very big demonstration in the state capital about a week ago. This sort of thing wouldn't have been happening 20 or 30 years ago. So that gives me hope. And I think international pressure, our experience at Survival and talking with our partners in Brazil and other countries, we tend to think, well, there's nothing we can do. And I don't think that's true. The indigenous peoples want, as well as the national support that they're getting in some quarters, they want international pressure. And so, the UN Human Rights Commissioners just made a big speech in UN and mentioned the Yanomami in Bunduruku and the situation. So they're getting their messages out to these large bodies. But individuals, all of us can do something. You can participate in survival's campaigns. And we know, for example, we had a good example of the impact of international pressure just the other day. A number of territories where there are uncontacted indigenous people in Brazil are protected by what are called land protection orders, which are renewed every 2 or 3 years. And a number of these protection orders are coming up for renewal. And we were campaigning for one protection order, which was about to expire, to be renewed. And people were saying it's not going to be renewed. The land grabbers are there. They've already invaded. Bolsonaro himself, with his inflammatory speeches, is encouraging invasion of indigenous territories, trying to rip up their rights. And we did a massive campaign with indigenous organizations in Brazil, and they've renewed the protection order. And I have to say, I didn't think they were going to do that, but they have. And so I think, although we may not know it, pressure from all areas does have an impact. We just don't always know at the time. So we just have to keep that up and support the indigenous peoples in any way we can in what they're doing, which I think is tremendous and so vital.
Okay, so we are about to go out to questions from the audience. I wondered, Fiona, whether you could put some links in the chat to what Survival's doing and campaigns that people...
That's why I disappeared last time.
Okay, right.
I'm so technologically inept that I managed to...
Well, I mean, just because, obviously people are here and they're interested to hear what you say, and I'm sure people would like to do things to support the Yanomami and to help, and if they can, then that would be great to put that into the chat. And so now I'm looking to Rowan and looking to people, anybody who wants to ask a question, or are there particular questions you could pull out from the chat for us to begin with, Rowan?
Hi, David. Hi, Sue. Hi, Fiona and everyone. Noswetha. Just a couple of questions in the chat, which you might have almost covered already. Is there anything that COP26 or related to that is doing that we should know about, or are there any other ways that we can help? That's a question from Bob in the chat.
Well, I think COP26 is a really good opportunity, and there are a number of fringe meetings happening, and we're talking with indigenous colleagues in Brazil about the possibility of some of them coming over, which would be a really great chance to get their messages out directly to the heads of states and everybody. So, I mean, for the moment, I'd just say watch this space, and when we know stuff, we'll be posting it up on Survival social media. But I think also, like, pressurizing your MP and the government here about the fact, about a whole load of stuff. I mean, there is a campaign going on about supermarkets and raising awareness about products coming from Brazil, whether it's soya or beef or whatever, and the impact this is having on indigenous peoples in the environment. So, I mean, there's not enough time to go into detail about that, but we have an action on our website, and there are other NGOs over here that are also involved in that. So I think as a consumer, we do have a certain amount of power here, and we should be holding to account the politicians in this country, and particularly to do with things like, international mining corporations. London is the centre of the mining world, and keeping the pressure up on those corporations which have their eyes on indigenous territories, because one of the things the Bolsonaro government wants to do is open up indigenous territories to large-scale corporate mining, as well as to this very harmful sort of wildcat mining that we're seeing in the Yanomami territory. So these are all things and issues that people here as taxpayers and citizens can get involved in.
I mean, I would just like to jump in here because I live in Herefordshire, so I sit down with people from Avara or Cargill, and the soya from the Amazon is, being brought over here, shipped to Liverpool, trucked down to Hereford, about 5 miles from where I am. It's being turned into chicken food and fed to chickens that end up at Tesco's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or Nando's or wherever. So, it's not just, in a sense, the miners over there that are impacting. It is also our relationship effectively with the Yanomami that we can also do something about, because, those bigger trends are huge, aren't they, in terms of what's happened to the Amazon over the last 30 or 40 years through agribusiness and so on. So that was just me sounding off. Any more questions that you've got, Ron, from the chat?
Yeah, there are a couple more questions in the chat. There's a question from Alex Turner. I'm going to read it out. I'm curious about something Sue said earlier about Davi's TV interview in the 80s, when asked about what message he wanted to share. What was that message? And has that changed at all?
And not really. He was very worried at the time about the invasion of their land by gold miners, by gold panners, and he was over there to sort of tell this message that, and even then he was quite aware that what goes on in Yanomami land is going to affect the rest of the world. I mean, they have it in some of the mythology that if we go on cutting down the trees, because at least in their mythology, the world is flat, then the whole of the world will fall through the hole that they open up when mining. And I mean, I think over the intervening years, it's become increasingly clear that indeed what goes on in the Amazon will affect us all. I mean, currently Brazil and the whole of the southern cone of Latin America is being affected by a very serious drought. And it's now very clear that this drought is at least partly caused by deforestation in the Amazon. They're upsetting the cloud movements. I mean, for hundreds of years, the prevailing trade winds have come over from the Atlantic, picking up a lot of moisture. And then they've moved across the Amazon basin, and then they hit the Andes and they moved south. And they form what was recently called flying rivers, because it's only really recently, very recently, that scientists actually understand what's going on. And if you cut down the forest, you disrupt this whole pattern, and the flying rivers are very much weakened, and that's what's happening this year. So the whole Brazil is in one of the most serious droughts ever, and so agribusiness, which sometimes is quite active in campaigning against the indigenous populations and says they've got too much land, they now are being affected by the fact that a lot of this land is being cut down, and I think they are becoming aware that the indigenous peoples are the best guardians of the forest. But Davi was giving us this message years and years ago in a very sort of graphic and using different terminology, but that was what was underneath, was what he was saying.
Do you want to add anything to that, Fiona, or shall we?
No, I don't think so, actually.
Yeah, okay. Other questions, Rowan, are you picking up?
Yeah, it's a question from Neil. Do you think that the UK has enough clout in Brazil to strike a trade deal which will include indigenous people's rights and a ban on deforestation?
No.
That's a very short answer. We'll leave you there, Sue, and see if Fiona has a longer answer.
Well, it did with the EU. It could have, the EU was negotiating a trade deal with Mercosur, the Mercosur countries, which now doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And not that I had much hope from the UK sticking up for indigenous rights, but now that the Brexit we can't even negotiate a deal with the US, and I think it's very unlikely that there'll be a deal with Brazil.
Fiona?
Yeah, I think probably Sue's right. I mean, I think we still have to, keep the pressure up on this government. But I agree. I don't think it has much clout. But I think, as Sue said, that the agribusiness in Brazil, there have been signs that they are concerned that the Bolsonaro government approach is really, even for them or sectors of the business, going over the top. Because worldwide international opinion is so disgusted by what's happening in Brazil in terms of Bolsonaro's, what he says about indigenous peoples and the Amazon, and all the lies and corruption as well of him and people in government. So yeah, I really don't know though.
There is quite a lot of pressure for a trade boycott on agricultural produce from Brazil, which you can do without a trade agreement, of course. And the agribusiness is worried about this, partly because if European countries start doing it, there'll be a lot more pressure for the rest of the world to do it. So people like Yanomami, who is a very large soy farmer in Brazil, and I'm sure he's not motivated by genuine concern for the survival of the indigenous peoples, but he's worried about the future of his exports to Europe. And so he and other people, as Fiona was saying, in the agribusiness lobby, have been disassociating themselves with some of the more sort of radical and extreme anti-indigenous positions taken by Bolsonaro.
And we've also had evidence of some companies, I mean, Vale mining companies put out a statement recently that it will not mine in indigenous territories, and that's a first. The devil will probably be in the detail, because what will an indigenous territory look like I don't know if the Bolsonaro government continues in this way, or the Supreme Court rules against indigenous rights in this landmark ruling, the marco temporal, or the time limit trick, as we call it. So it's all pretty murky, but at least they've come out and said that. I think it does show that pressure is working sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, is that in a sense because they see a time beyond Bolsonaro, so that they, feel that, I mean, this leads into a question from Nick about the upcoming elections, but that, they're starting to think that he's not necessarily here for that much longer.
Yeah, possibly. But I think the problem is he's got another year to go, and a lot of damage could be done in a year. And if the Supreme Court rules against the indigenous people, that really will be very serious. So, I think anything could happen. And people have talked about a possible coup, and, the military are divided in their support for Bolsonaro. I think it's very, very hard to read the future over this. And meanwhile, picking up on someone else's question about the PCC, one of the things that's happening in the Yanomami territory, when the first mining invasion happened in the 1980s, there were 20,000 miners there, and they did a huge amount of damage in all sorts of senses, environmentally, socially, in health terms. But what we're seeing now with this current invasion, which has been going on for at least 5 or 10 years, is that the actual nature of this so-called wildcat gold mining is changing. And it's not just in the Yanomami territory, it's in the Munduruku territory, the Kayapo, other indigenous territories. And it's big business. They're using these huge mechanized drags to get the gold from the riverbeds. They've got whole fleets of helicopters, which are hugely expensive to operate. The Yanomami have been facing in the last few months a large number of armed attacks, and they're throwing smoke bombs into communities, shooting at them. This is taking on a whole new level, if you like, of operation. Very serious big business. We've now got drug traffickers, narcotraficantes in there. We've got, somebody asked the question about the PCC, which is a very large criminal gang based in Sao Paulo, who posted up a video the other day inside the Yanomami territory, wearing masks, brandishing guns. I mean, this is a whole new order of things. And until now, and thanks to the Yanomami's pressure, the authorities have turned a blind eye. And this has been allowed to go on for years and years and years. And we have hugely serious levels of mercury contamination. So it's different now to what it was 30 years ago, and very alarming.
I'd just like to add one thing about the elections next year. I think it's going to be a very rough ride. I mean, I think if there were fair elections, Bolsonaro would be defeated. That's what the opinion polls are suggesting. But he's got a hard core of supporters of perhaps 25–30% of the population who just get their information about what's going on from social media, which he manipulates very skillfully. And he will try to get them on the streets. I mean, I think one of the main reasons why Bolsonaro doesn't want to step down from government is he's up to his neck in corruption, him and his 3 sons. There's a huge amount of evidence that they have been robbing the state for many years. And opponents have made it very clear that they will try to get them into prison as soon as he hasn't got the protection from being in office. And I think above all, Bolsonaro is an opportunist. He will try and manipulate and perhaps organize a coup and just to save his own skin. And so, I mean, when I first went to Brazil, it was in the throes of a real military dictatorship, and people were disappearing, and there was a lot of censorship. And it's really upsetting as I come to the end of my journalist career to see the similar kind of situation arising in Brazil. At the moment, there isn't quite censorship, certainly not on the same scale. Brazil has got a progressive constitution in 1989, which they passed when Brazil returned to civilian rule after their 25 years of military dictatorship, and that has given people more rights and more ability to stand up to attempts at a coup. But I think Bolsonaro is extremely ruthless and above all puts his own survival and the survival of his family ahead of anything else. So I think it is going to be a difficult year.
Okay, thank you for that. I wonder if we could come to Neil Pitcairn's question about the Yanomami, and do you want to read that out?
Yeah, so Neil says he had the pleasure of spending 3 hours at the Claudia Buja photographic exhibition at the Barbican recently. And the question is, do the Yanomami now feel that they have enough control artistically and politically to express and represent themselves without non-Yanomami assistance?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think Claudia Antujar's photos have to sort of be put in the context of, I mean, I thought it was an amazing exhibition. And when she first started working with the Yanomami didn't have access to cameras and technology that they do now. And so I think they regard her photographs as a very important historical record of things that have happened to them. And a lot of her early photographs show the impacts of this huge road that was bulldozed through part of their territory in the early 1970s. And as you saw in The Last Forest, some of her photographs of young Yanomami children suffering from all sorts of illnesses that had been brought in by outsiders, things like flu and measles, to which they had no resistance, and still today have very little resistance. So she has been a tremendous force and fighter for Yanomami rights, and co-funded the Pro-Yanomami Commission in Brazil, and travelled around the world with Davi. So her photographs really, I think, are an important part of the campaign in the history. But to answer the question, from what I can see now, the Yanomami set up their own organization called Hutukara in 2004. They're holding their own assemblies and meetings, campaigning, going down to Brasilia, pressurizing people like the Ministério Público, the public prosecutor's office, which is a very important office in Brazil, because actually it's thanks often to the public prosecutors that cases go before the courts where indigenous rights are being violated or abuses are happening. And I think some of the public prosecutors are doing amazing work, and it's really important. So the Yanomami are actively engaging those of them who form part, and it's not just Hutukara, there's several Yanomami associations. And so yes, I think they don't need or want anyone to speak for them. That wasn't the case some time ago. So now I think what we all are trying to do is to amplify those voices on a global stage. I mean, that's one of the functions of survival, is to enable those voices, their voices, to come up, because of course, you know, who can speak better than they themselves about what is happening.
Yeah. Sue, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just something quickly. And Claudia Andrzejara is a remarkable woman. She was born in Transylvania, which was then part of Hungary. Her father was Jewish, and she and her mother had to travel through Germany to get out, and she was 13, and I mean, she had a very traumatic time. She was actually held by the Gestapo for a while, but they got out. And Claudia always has had this enormous sympathy for the survivors, for the people who are fighting for their survival. And so when she reached Brazil, she's really dedicated her whole life to the Yanomami Indians, and she's a remarkably effective photographer. And as Fiona has said, perhaps her contribution wouldn't have been so important today, but back then, when the Yanomami hadn't got so much skill in dealing with the outside work and campaigning for themselves, she played a very important role. And it's even possible to think that if she hadn't spent so much time campaigning for the creation of what they call the Yanomami Park, this sort of huge indigenous reserve, it might not have happened, because she was just so dedicated. She was very firm. She wasn't always an easy person to deal with. She could be quite intransigent at times, but she knew what she wanted to achieve, and she played an important role. And I'm slightly worried she's getting a bit written out of their history, because she isn't a renowned anthropologist. She's a photographer, a very skilled photographer. But you know, I think it is important to remember just how important she was at that time.
Yeah, I mean, she was a witness to genocide, because what was happening at the time she was genocide, because it could have been prevented. The government at the time knew what was going on. Didn't remove the gold miners for a long time, and I think that alone, and the beauty of her photographs, which are very intimate photographs, which only come from somebody who has spent long periods of time with the Yanomami and who really understands the way they see the world. I mean, I think she captures that really beautifully. So they're very artistic, as well as being an important historical document and testimony, really, to a very terrible part of Yanomami history.
Well, good to think that there are people who also help as well as hinder Yanomami. Have we got any more questions, Ron? Or are we...
There are not any more questions, but there are a couple of comments come in. So one from Neil: as a local Greenpeace activist, he says he's visiting Tesco stores and talking to the store managers about soy and deforestation, and he encourages others to join that aspect of the campaign. And then there's a comment from Bob about trees giving off microscopic particles as they sweat, which kind of creates, I think, like clouds around them. So I think we're talking about the sort of microclimate effects of the trees, and that made me reflect on all the kind of water cycles, of course, that the trees and the rivers are part of, and how that connects everything. And also David alluding earlier to the connection between what's happening in the Amazon and what's happening to our rivers here through the pollution from the chicken farms and the dairy farms where this soy is being fed to the animals. I've got a question, if I may jump in.
Yeah.
And obviously, like, the rainforest is quite a challenging environment to be in. How, and you've got direct experience of being there, Sue and Fiona. How difficult would it have been for the filmmakers making this film?
Well, you've very difficult. I think you know better than me.
I think immensely challenging, because where the film was made in Watoriki, Davi's community, which means the people of the Windy Mountain, which is the mountain you see in the background, really the only way in there, unless you want to spend days and days paddling in a canoe, is to fly in a 6-seater plane. So just getting there alone is a huge logistical challenge. And then when you're operating inside the communal house, I mean, I remember that I was there once, and at one time, and there seemed to be chickens there, and every time you tried to film it, the cock would start crowing and you'd have to start again. I imagine there was a lot of that. And then you have just the conditions, humidity. I've had my cameras break down. One of my cameras got invaded by cockroaches, microscopic cockroaches, and when I developed the film, there all kind of black bits came up on the film. I'm sure obviously these filmmakers had highly sophisticated equipment and things, but nevertheless, and then when you're doing the shots in the forest, I mean, just walking through the forest, I've been with lots of filmmakers, and they're lugging these massive cameras around, and there's always just saplings coming out of the trail, because the indigenous people cut trails through the forest, but the forest grows back quite quickly. And I mean, I broke my elbow falling over a sapling, which I didn't see, which the Yanomami thought was very funny. I mean, it was quite funny in a way, but so I think logistically and in terms of the the climate, immensely challenging. But for me, what I thought was wonderful was how the film captured. I think the Yanomami that in the film are natural actors. I mean, they didn't seem to be at all fazed by the camera, and I think obviously, that you can't plan for that. I mean, it just sort of happens or it doesn't. So yeah, but I wouldn't underestimate how hard it is. And in fact, one of the filmmaker, I mean, one of the hazards of the forest, especially in stormy conditions, is that trees fall down, and a tree fell down on top of him, and he was very badly injured. And so they had to cope with all of that, and nothing ever goes to plan, of course. I mean, probably nowhere in the world all our plans, the best laid plans, but you have these extra challenges, and tropical storms, etc.
I've got another question, which hopefully you might know something about. But why do you think that particular story, the one that was acted out with the woman from beneath the lake, was chosen by the Yanomami for the film?
It's their creation myth, isn't it, Fiona? I mean, weren't they trying to just tell us how they see, at least in mythology, see the formation of the world? And it's for us from outside, it's a strange story, and it was wonderfully acted, wasn't it?
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic.
Emerging from the water.
Yawarioma, who was the water spirit in the film, I think there's also she's sort of said to seduce people and bring them in. I mean, she's not sort of necessarily a good spirit. I mean, she can be good, she can be bad, and I think that came across, that kind of thing of like, and then the person whose husband had sort of disappeared in the forest. I don't think we ever really found out what happened to him. Or I think it was actually a dream. But I think the water spirit is an important and powerful spirit, which is possibly also why they chose to act out that sequence.
I mean, it was very clear just how much water was important to them, isn't it? Because quite often you think of the Amazon, the rainforest, and things growing very quickly and all that sort of stuff. But actually, they're kind of, right from the start, isn't it? Sort of on a rock. If you're hunter gathering, you're gathering from the water as well as from, your your gardens in the jungle and in the forest, and different ways that they live and how dependent on water they are. Which I think is going to come to a nice kind of rounding up in the end and saying, this is eco cinema reflecting on water, and that that's one of the film's certainly its strengths, isn't it? It's making us think about all that and some of the things that we've heard tonight from Sue, and the rivers in the air and so on. And so I'd just like to thank Sue and Fiona very much for giving up their evening and coming and joining us. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I'm very pleased particularly that Survival could be here, and that you plug the campaigns and plug the book. I think I'm going to go off and buy the book, because we did have a previous event with a woman talking about shamanism and so on, and it's something that has just increasingly fascinates me. So and also just in a sense to plug the film. I mean, I did get the chance to watch it for a second time, actually on a big screen in a cinema, but it is well worth a second viewing, because I think there are quite a lot of subtle things. It's a subtly made film. It's not didactic. It just puts things out there that women talk about how they might get some more money by making baskets, and you can miss some of those things as you go along, and I think it really does repay a second viewing. And recommend it to your friends, recommend it to everybody, because I think it's only there for another few days and then it's gone. And I think we can talk about the film, but the experience of the film itself is really something wonderful, and testament to the Yanomami's ability to control their own artistic destiny, at least in that respect. So thank you both, and thank you all in the audience here, and thank you to Rowan for moderating the chat, and to Gareth in the background, keeping all the technical things on the go. So enjoy the rest of the festival, and hopefully we'll be able to do this sort of thing again before too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.